And good morning, everyone. Happy Monday morning to you. Welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma, and I do appreciate you being with me. Hope you had an absolutely fantastic weekend. I tell you, here in southern Oklahoma, the wind, it was really kind of funny. On the news and weather broadcast, they said, oh, we're going to have winds somewhere around 15 miles per hour, gusting possibly to 20. Well, it was more like wind of 25 gusting to 40. I mean, you just couldn't go outside. If you extended your arms, you took off flying. I mean, it was just absolutely crazy. But it was beautiful insofar as sunshine and temperature is concerned. But it was hilarious at the disparity between what the weather forecasters and weathermen were saying and what the actual conditions were outside. Who was it that said it's amazing that you can have a profession, and I mean no disrespect to any weather person. They have to go to school, lots of training and what have you. But they're wrong about 50 or 60% of the time. And they can always get back and say, well, the weather sure played a trick on us last night or yesterday, didn't it? Yeah, it did. Anyway, all that aside, thank you again for joining me here on Morning Musings. And we are continuing our discussion. Now, we're focused on the Olivet Discourse, specifically Matthew 25, 31 and following. This suggestion, of course, is, in the majority of commentators, this has to be an end of time, end of the Christian age event. Now, keep in mind, as I've shared with you before, the Christian age has no end. So that really ought to put that argument to rest. But what I've been doing over the last few videos is demonstrating the correlation between Daniel chapter 12, Matthew chapter 25, and then we're going to Revelation chapter 11. Now this morning, I'm going to expand that correlation to Daniel 12, Matthew 13, and Matthew chapter 25. And there's a very distinct reason for that. And it being this: Daniel chapter 12, verse 2, very clearly foretold, undeniably, time of the resurrection. Now, I must take note of this. In the postmillennial world, it has been held that Daniel chapter 12, verse 2 is a very clear prediction of the biological, physical resurrection of the dead. For instance, Kenneth Gentry, a number of years ago, went on record, Daniel chapter 12, verse 2 is a very clear prediction of the end of time. Biological resurrection out of literal dust. Well, as Mr. Gentry began to encounter full preterists and to read our literature, all of a sudden he discovered that Daniel chapter 12, verse 7 posits the resurrection, and we'll have more to say about this later, posits that resurrection of Daniel chapter 12, 2 at the time when, quote, the power of the holy people would be completely shattered. Mr. Gentry knows that was in AD 70. Therefore, Mr. Gentry, in his later writings, has gone on record saying Daniel chapter 12, verse 2 is not a prophecy of the end of time, biological resurrection. It is rather a prediction of the spiritual resurrection of Israel that occurred in AD 70. Now, if you want documentation of what I've just gone over, just contact me. I'll be glad to give you the citations from Kenneth Gentry's book, or books, for you to see for yourself that the power of the message of covenant eschatology is forcing men who are the opponents of covenant eschatology. It is forcing them to move closer and closer and closer to the truth. They just need to come on and accept the fact the resurrection, the end of the age, was in AD 70. Because that fact is undeniable. Okay, so we move on this morning, and I shared with you last week how different authors, commentators, and scholars go to Daniel chapter 12, and they see it predictive of the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. And they engage in what can only be described as verbal and theological gymnastics. What they write is puzzling, it's confused, it's confusing. And let me give you a for instance, and I've taken note of this in my review of his book, Mr. Kyle Pope's book, Thinking About AD 70. Mr. Kyle Pope tells us that Daniel chapter 12, verse 3, which reads, "Those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the firmament, those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever." Well, Mr. Pope tells us, as well as scholars such as John Collins, this refers to the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. But then, amazingly, Daniel chapter 12, verse 4, "But you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased." And so, Mr. Pope tells us, okay, verse 3, and again, this is not Mr. Pope alone. This is noted scholars such as John Collins. Verse 3, time of Antiochus Epiphanes. Verse 4, what does Mr. Pope say about that? Oh, verse 4 is the end of Daniel's life. So once again, Mr. Pope has Daniel chapter 12, verse 1, time of the Great Tribulation, time of Antiochus Epiphanes. Daniel chapter 12, verse 2, the end of time resurrection. Daniel chapter 12, verse 3, the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. Daniel chapter 12, verse 4, the end of Daniel's life. Now, I have asked this question before. How in the world would a reader of the text ever come to those conclusions? Ladies and gentlemen, the only way you can do that is by engaging in the worst sort of eisegesis that reads into the text. Well, Daniel chapter 12, verse 2 is very clearly the end of time resurrection, so that did not happen in the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. Therefore, there's a gap of so far 2,200 years between the time of Antiochus Epiphanes and the end of time, the supposed end of time. But you see, ladies and gentlemen, this simply doesn't work. So here we have in Daniel chapter 12, verse 3, the prediction that at the time of the resurrection, and yes, it is the time of the resurrection. Now, notice again verse 1, Daniel's people, those written in the book, would be delivered. When? At the time of the resurrection, because of the connecting particle of verse 2, as I shared with you last week. Now, verse 3, okay, we have the resurrection of the righteous and the unrighteous, the just and the unjust. And the just receive what? Everlasting life. Those who are wise, is this the just or not? Those who are just shall shine like the brightness of the firmament. Now, let's take note of something. I mentioned Daniel 12, Matthew 13, Matthew chapter 25. Daniel chapter 12, explicitly resurrection. Let me ask you a question. Is the resurrection the time of the harvest? Who would deny that? Is the resurrection the end of the age? Who would deny that? So Daniel chapter 12, resurrection, end of the age, the righteous shining forth in the kingdom. Well, in Matthew chapter 13, Jesus told the parable of the end of the age. The end of the age harvest. I'm going to begin reading with verse 39. The enemy who sowed them is the devil. Harvest is at the end of the age. The reapers are the angels. Therefore, as the tares are gathered and burned in the fire, so it will be at the end of this age. Now that's the New King James translation. The Son of Man will send out his angels. They shall gather out of his kingdom all things that offend, those who practice lawlessness, that's the unjust, who are gathered at the end of the age. Right? And will cast them into the furnace of fire. There will be wailing and gnashing of teeth. Then when? At the time of the harvest, at the end of the age, then the righteous who are participating in the resurrection at the end of the age, then the righteous will shine forth as the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Let him who has ears to hear, let him hear. Ladies and gentlemen, Matthew 13:43 is a direct echo of Daniel chapter 12, verse 3. Pardon me. So what do we have? Daniel chapter 12, resurrection, end of the age, the righteous shining forth in the kingdom. What do we have in Matthew 13? The end of the age, the harvest, which is the resurrection, and the righteous shining forth in the kingdom. So the question therefore becomes, how would anybody delineate, given those perfect parallels, how could anybody delineate? And yet, Mr. Pope says verse 3 is the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. Well, was the time of Antiochus Epiphanes the end of the age to which Jesus applied Daniel chapter 12? Patently not. Was the time of Antiochus Epiphanes the time of the end, as John Collins says? Patently not. Oh, well, you see, scholars such as John Collins don't have any problem at all saying, well, Daniel certainly predicted the end to come, the end of the age to come in the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, but of course it didn't come. See the problem? They just simply deny inspiration. Okay, so what do we have? Daniel chapter 12, resurrection, righteous shining forth at the time of the end. Matthew chapter 13, harvest, resurrection, end of the age, the righteous shining forth in the kingdom. Matthew chapter 25, the end of the age. I know the term doesn't appear, but that doesn't mean that the concept is not there. We can't engage in a logical fallacy called a negative fallacy, which says, oh, well, you know, a given word, term, or phrase is not found. Who denies that the resurrection is at the end of the age? Nobody. So, we have the end of the age, we have the resurrection. Once again, the word resurrection is not in Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following. Does anyone doubt that it's there? So we have end of the age, we have resurrection, and we have the righteous being rewarded with everlasting life, which means they shine forth in the kingdom. They inherit the kingdom. Enter thou into the joys of the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world, Jesus said. Now, getting ahead of myself, but Daniel chapter 12, verse 6. One angel asked another, when shall these things be? What shall be the end of these wonders? And one angel lifted up his right hand to heaven, his left hand up to heaven, and he swore by him who lives forever and ever. And he said, it shall be for a time, times and a half time, and when the power of the holy people has been completely shattered, all of these things must be fulfilled. What would be fulfilled? Resurrection, harvest, time of the end, righteous shining forth. That's the end of the age, the harvest, the righteous shining forth of Matthew 13. That is the end of the age and the harvest and entrance into the kingdom of Matthew chapter 25. All three of those would be fulfilled when the power of the holy people has been completely shattered. And folks, if you have any doubt about when that took place, you really need to look closer. There's no question about when the power of the holy people was completely shattered. It was in AD 70. Hey, thanks for joining me. Listen, get a copy of my book. I don't have it here. I'm moving things around. Yes, I do. Look, go to my website, donkpreston.com, BibleProphecy.com. Order a copy of my book, The Resurrection of Daniel, chapter 12, verse 2. Send me a note that says you saw the offer on YouTube or Facebook, and I'll refund your shipping. I have an extensive discussion of the correlation between Daniel chapter 12, Matthew 13, Matthew chapter 25, and Revelation 11, and we'll get there later. You'll be amazed at the evidence. Do yourself a favor, get a copy of the book, and I'll see you on the flip side.